Hello, everyone. We are back with episode 41, and we have a very, very special guest today. Our speaker is Gabriel Udoh. He is joining us from Germany, and it's kind of late where you are. So thank you so much for being here with me today. Alisa unfortunately couldn't make it. So, Gabriel, in a few words, please, would you tell us about your career and about yourself, or whatever you think people need to know before we start today's episode?
Thank you so much, Alina. And it's not too late in Germany. It's just about
It's
9
later
p.m.
than here.
It's 9 p.m. Well, that's true, actually. All right. I just concluded my PhD in artificial intelligence, law, and society. I focused a lot more on the legal and ethical implications of artificial intelligence in military systems. My background is mostly in law. I have a master's degree in international law and ethics, and also have a bachelor's degree in law. Prior to that, I was a software developer back in Nigeria. So yeah, mostly currently I'm a research fellow with the Robotics and AI Society in Berlin. And yeah, I I'm grateful to be here today. I've always looked forward to speaking a little more about the subject of today. So thank you for the kind invitation.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're here for, right? To cover the
Yeah,
subject
yeah.
that people are not really, in my view, covering enough. So let's get to it. If you want to start your presentation, hold on.
Yeah, okay.
That's the one, right?
Yes, okay. Let's see. That worked.
Yep.
All right. So
Perfect.
I'll try to spend the next couple of minutes. I say couple of minutes because I'm not very certain about what couple of minutes would mean. As much as I can, I'll try to be brief. But today, I just want to look at the landscape of AI in Africa, and I want to focus more on the strategies rather than the technology itself. Though at some point, I'll talk a little more about the technology. First of all, it's important to notice that in most conversations around artificial intelligence strategies and sometimes even the technology, there's more focus on the European Union, of course, the US, China, and the other, what I call the big names. And sometimes you'd even hear some calls on Africa or African countries or African organizations to adopt existing regulatory structures or sometimes even ethical values from the global stages, right? And I used my hand to show that global stages because many times I have contended a lot of times that the representation of Africa, where there is a representation in those stages, is a little bit questionable. Sometimes it's completely absent. And many times it's not the fault of those stages. It's just because Africa is so diverse. What you call representation might be a little different, right? Might be a little more complicated. What adequate representation would mean could get a little more complicated. We've seen some organizations advising African governments to adopt UNESCO recommendations on AI ethics, on ethics of AI rather, or some of their tools like the RAM, the Readiness Assessment Tool, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't have a problem with um, learning from the global north or from the rest of the global community. But I believe that the major issue with wholly adopting from what others are doing is usually it brings a lot of complications because first of all the contexts are wildly different. The contexts are really, and this comes with a lot of complications. We've seen this with data protection regulations. I use an example with the Nigerian Data Protection Act, which uh, is mostly um, a reflection of the GDPR, right? And we've noticed in the last years that I mean, it's 2 years old, really. The implementation is not as smooth. We've seen many diverse issues in many areas. First of all, the awareness when it comes to data protection issues is a lot higher in Europe, where the GDPR was originally conceived. Then the economic circumstances differ. So implementation capacity of would differ. For instance, you would need to train experts, you would need to support reinforcement, and so on and so forth. Again, there's also this idea that Nigeria, in this case, has a lot more SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So there's not a lot of wealthy big tech companies, for instance, or big companies. So it will place a lot of compliance burdens on businesses because uh, compliance requires a lot of spending in many instances. And so that takes us to the original issue, especially with AI strategy. Africa has had a lot going on. Like I mentioned when we started talking, the 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 the, the focus on the rest of the world seems to create this shadow, cast a shadow over Africa that makes specialists insist that Africa should copy, right? Sometimes because there's no idea as to what Africa has, and sometimes because there's the available data does not really look like what really is on the ground. And there are some strategies that were there even before the popularization of AI, so-called by ChatGPT, just barely 2 years ago. I say that because most times when you ask people questions about AI, the focus goes all the way down to ChatGPT, and
Mm.
it's a very small pocket of artificial intelligence to focus on. By the report, there's a report by Intel Point that shows that 16 African countries out of 54, by as of July 2025, have launched AI strategies, and many others are still in the pipeline. Now, first we have the AU's continental AI strategy of July 2024, and this already highlighted, there's a growing emphasis on this with regards to data strategies, data sovereignty, open data, and the need to have legal protection against issues like biases and privacy breaches and so on and so forth. And this is 2024, but there are others that came a lot earlier. For instance, we have that of Mauritius, and I was gladly surprised when I read about this sometime last year. We're going to go back to this because I would like us to look at some things that have been there that I read in many instances that Africa has been required to copy from others or to borrow a leaf from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, we've already had this even before some other countries that we are now required to borrow from. So we've had this from Mauritius. Egypt had a national AI strategy. The first version was in 2021, and this is the updated version of 2025 that's going to run for the next 5 years. Then we have one from Ghana, 2022. Um, then from Benin Republic, 2023 to 2027. Then Nigeria came up with an AI strategy August last year, and South Africa had October last year. Then of course, we look back at what Egypt has in the new strategy document for as of January this year. Also this year, we've had Kenya come up with something, and then I think Lesotho, and so on. And there are many others in the pipeline. And again, the impression now, I think, should be, let's look at what we already have on ground and see how others can learn. There's a lot of news around town that most of these strategies also have they've adopted some aspects of the global language or what comes from the global north. This, to a large extent, might be true, but when you look deeply at some of these documents, you'll see a reflection. Even though I wish we had more of a reflection of our cultural differences or our own society's reflection on these strategies. Let's pedal back a little bit to what Mauritius has now. This was already available as November 2018. The preparation began a lot earlier than that. And Mauritius' strategy, the major idea was, um, I think what I find really compelling with this is they have this sector-specific priority projects. So they don't just go into artificial intelligence generally. They look at the sectors: manufacturing, healthcare, fintech, agriculture. They went as far down as ocean economy, and they look at some ethical issues. Some of which really struck me was they already consider that failing to integrate ethics into an AI system could amplify structural discrimination and reproduce biases in the data they are based on. Now, this means that prior to what we have now, African countries were already talking about the dangers and the ethical, the moral dangers in the use of artificial intelligence. We've seen biases, we've seen issues like discrimination. If you look, you'd also see some other ethical issues that have been mentioned in different places in the document, but this just really struck me. And another thing that came to my mind was that this strategy, first of all, the government looked at the social issues that plagued the country. So they built a strategy around their problems, which is what I mentioned earlier, that it's really important to know what you need, not to just copy what others have, because it's the big thing now. Oh, we have an AI strategy. And if you look at this, you'll see that one of the social issues they have is road accidents. Again, there are many others, but if you look at road accidents, if you compare it with places like Europe, it's the difference is going to be really, really wide. So they considered this problem, they considered other problems like drug abuse, congestion, issues of law and order, public security, and so on and so forth. And they came up with, it builds areas of focus for their strategy. This would definitely make their strategy more more effective because it's contextual based on what the society has. Now, whether there's proper implementation or not is a different ballgame entirely, because there are concerns about Africa's capability to implement regulations. We've seen this in earlier times, and sometimes it's not because the regulations are borrowed. Sometimes it's just because we have our own internal issues, which, of course, is not up for the discussion today. In general, I think we can look back home. The essence of this is we can look at what we already have and consider how the diversity of cultures, of the flexibility of our society, can really help in bring this success in AI regulation. At the end of the day, if Africa is able to come up with a central AI regulation like Europe has so far with the AI Act, then it should consider our specific problems. It should look deeper at the issues that we have. But in all, I think we have we've made a lot of advancements, not just in the technology, but in strategies. And I know in the next couple of months, maybe in the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot more in this area. The second issue on the talking point is I got had a lot of questions about people, Africa being used as a testing ground for foreign technology, and this has been it really comes up most of the times. Many times we have conversations around technology, and my reaction to that is usually that it's not just in technology, it's nothing new, right? And it's mostly the global south, but Africa takes a lot of heat. This news came up some 2 or 3 days ago first, that and the headline is it's really scary. That's the Namibian president, the first female president of Africa, in Africa. She said that our people are not experiments, and then the country went ahead to reject the Bill Gates Foundation birth control trial. You'd see things like trial. So we're just testing it here. If it works, then we can go ahead. If it doesn't work, well, we'll fold up and leave and come back with something new. That's the impression. But it's not, like I said, it's not just technology, but more so in technology. And one of the most recent instances has been the issue of WorldCoin in Kenya. I mean, this made the news when the court eventually said, hey, you need to stop data collection. WorldCoin was founded mostly by two groups, two organizations, Tools for Humanity and WorldCoin Foundation, and they came up with this idea that we could collect your data and do whatever with it. We'll get into that. But when we look at what was happening, what this project was doing in Kenya, it left a lot of questions in our mind. It still does leave a lot of questions in my mind. You read the news from the office of the Kenyan Data Protection Commissioner, and Here it says from their statements, the WorldCoin project in Kenya commenced in May 2021. The project has since collected the following data from Kenyan subjects. And if you read this, it's like just handing your whole life to someone you don't know. There's a BBC headline that says that Kenyans just went for free money. And that's really alarming to see, right? What is the attraction? Why do we seem to have lot? This is just one of the instances, right? The attraction, first of all, is the cheap labor, which is something we'll talk about later. It's easier to get labor in Africa. Then there's the not very wealthy society that would definitely catch could make do with $45, like in the case of this world coin scenario, which we're going to talk about subsequently. Then there's also the fact that there are weak regulatory frameworks in Africa. That's the perception. When compared to Europe, when compared to the US, the regulatory frameworks, especially tech regulatory frameworks, are not as strong as what we have in the rest of Europe, in the rest of the world. But I believe that we're coming up, and that's why we could see this happen, that the Kenyan High Court came up and said, no, you can't do this. We've had similar instances in Nigeria where the court held that Meta was fined, and even though they threatened to leave the country, to pack up and leave it, it didn't really matter because of similar issues, data protection issues, testing policies to see whether it's something that would work. Meanwhile, if you go to the rest of the world, if you come to Europe, the policies for the user policies for these technologies are wildly different, right? And this usually what struck me most in that conversation was what Altman and Blania said as far back as 2023. I didn't really get the idea at the time, but when I read the um, their speech, the first thing that struck me was that they already had this perception that it could fail. Well, we're just trying this to see if it's going to be successful, and they started with, if successful, we believe, right? So not that we know, we believe that WorldCoin could drastically increase economic opportunity, scale a reliable solution for distinguishing humans from AI online, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And this again leaves us with the question as to what if it fails? What happens then? And then leads us to that conception that there's certainly an attraction in Africa. There's the diversity of data. There's the ease of getting people to come out, probably because of poverty-related issues or the absence of very wealthy communities or the existence of not very strong regulatory frameworks for this, or when there are regulatory frameworks, the lack of enforcement in many instances. And this, I think this answers the question as to whether we truly have the situation where Africa gets get some of these policies, some of these ideas, or even technologies tested. And this is just a few. There are lots of them. There are many others that do not really make the news. Again, I talked about cheap labor, and this led me to the third issue that we quickly will just look at today. So I would leave. I want to leave as much time as possible for questions so the conversation can go on and I can also hear what others have to say about this. Uh, the issue of cheap labor raises a more pertinent question as to the exploitation of African data workers by big tech. I've seen lots of news about this, and especially in recent times. You run into news headlines like this, right? And I believe that one of the most important, one of the most vital ethical concerns in AI is the question as to the how moral or how legal the design processes of that technology has been, right? Including how data was collected and from whom, right? If you have to commit a crime to get data or to breach some ethical um, values to get data, or like we talked about the issue of WorldCoin, then it questions the ethical validity of the AI at the end of the day. How did you collect the data? Where did you get the data from? Who owns the data? Does the owner know that you got this data from him? Does the owner know how much of the data you're using and for what you're using? Now, many times we tend to just celebrate the innovations, like we have ChatGPT and the other large language models that are there. I say this because that's where most of the news is around these days. But we forget where the backbone of the creation itself, the data and the people behind them. You know, Um, Again, back to the issue of there was a question about ChatGPT, the data that was collected in Kenya, and so on and so forth. Now, as at 2021, 2022, OpenAI outsourced, they had this content moderation contract and with Sama, a local Kenyan company. And they were paying the contractors $12, according to the news, $12 per hour. And that's, again, that's questionable because if you look at the contemporaries of these companies in the other parts of the world, you definitely wouldn't pay $12 per hour for data, content moderation and data labeling. Now, to even make it worse, the workers for these organizations got between $1.30 to $2 per hour. That in my and they were working 9 hour shifts, right? In my calculation, that's about $170 a month. And I've spoken with a couple of Kenyans, and the idea I get is there's the perception that this is good money, right? Remember what I said in the previous conversation about cheap labor. The economy does not really, is not really supportive of people being wealthy. I'm trying to be careful with the language I use around this because there are people involved. And these workers they were asked to label, I think, 250 text messages within these 9 hour shifts, every shift. And aside that, many workers, there's been news, and many of the workers actually came out to claim that they were exposed to some very disturbing content, and many of which I can't mention here. Child abuse, murder, all sorts of things, self-harm, incest, and many other. And this brought a lot of mental health issues to many of the staff. At the end of the day, many of them were not still paid. You could see from this slide that some said they were low paid, and some were not even paid at the end of the day. Some were just fired at the end of 2022 when when Sama, the local company, quickly ended the contract and just fired lots of people and told them, well, you complained, now the contract has been withdrawn. We don't have anything else for you again. There are reports that over 200 jobs were cut down in Nairobi alone on this project. So you can imagine 200 people losing their jobs in this. And this explains sometimes why the laborers, unquote, would prefer to just keep quiet and do the job and get paid and go away. Before this, we've had Facebook, or as at the time, Facebook, Meta had a similar scenario. It was published by Times Magazine, I think, in 2022. Again, with this organization, SAMA, the African employees were paid, I think, about $1.50 per hour, and their job they were to review images of some very wild things going on. Again, content moderation. So this wasn't the first, and it doesn't look like it's going to be the last. I like to think of this issue as one of the very major areas that if Africa were to come up with, an effective AI regulation at some point, there has to be a lot of focus on what we bring in, on how our labor force is being used for the building of some of these technologies, for the creation or for data collection, for content moderation, whatever is eventually done, the people behind the technology, there has to be a lot of focus on the people, especially when the technology comes from the other side of the world and does not really pick up our own context, our local context, our legislation, doesn't speak originally does not speak our language. So in all, I feel there's still a lot more that can be done, but we've gone far. We've done a lot in the last couple of years, and this is just regards to AI. In other technologies, we've had lots and lots of tech startups that have been there even prior to 2018. I'll stop here, and as much as possible, I'll answer as many questions as I can. And the one I'll gladly pass it to the experts in the field. So thank you so much, Elena, and I look forward to what questions are there.
I sure do have questions if nobody else has them for now.
Sure.
So we obviously had a prep call before our live episode when we were talking about things to discuss today, and well, the conversation started with it was the rest of the world is not aware of Africa's AI strategies. Basically, as you put it in your slides as well,
Yep.
Mauritius had its AI strategy as early as 2018.
Yep.
And again, there's not a lot of even information circling around about it. And the world and the people, especially, in our common AI bubble, so to speak, there's not much, even I would say, interest in the things that are happening in Africa when it comes to AI. Yes, it's a strategic partner. US views it, China views it as well, and there's kind of this sort of struggle um, and race to win the global South as their partner. China views it as such, especially. And my question would be, why do you think is it? Why people think it's not important? Is that the reason? It's not important enough to pay attention. It's not really. It's not going to change anything. It's not. It doesn't affect anything. What do you think is that?
Well, yeah, thank you so much. I've thought of this question for years, and not just about technology. It's about how loud you are, right? And then, so I could say there are lots of factors. There are many reasons to this, but the focus is usually in what tables are designed globally and how Africa, whether Africa is invited to the table, because the conversations begin from specific places. Talk about the G20, the G7, OECD, UNESCO, and all that. That's where usually because news articles would pop out from there. Oh, the G20 came up with this idea on AI, G7 came up with these, the OECD has these, and UNESCO came up with this in collaboration with some African countries. And from there, you start hearing a little bit about Africa. Oh, yeah, so Africa can also come up to the table. So, because of the multiplicity of organizations that are not really from the global south, news articles tend to carry a lot of information on what is available in these organizations. And people naturally would think more towards what news they read, right? I learn a lot from LinkedIn because I follow some experts in this. So in the long run, like I mentioned myself, the Mauritius AI strategy, I actually learned about it last year when I thought, wait, we are just looking at Nigeria 2024. Is it possible that we didn't have anything earlier than now? And I started tracing it back. And I saw that Egypt had, oh, 2021. Oh, there's even an older one in 2018. That's because I also am guilty of this. I consume news from what's available. That's one. Um, Secondly, I believe this is also my own belief that Africa has a lot more going on, right? Internally, we're dealing with security issues. The rest of the world is also dealing with a lot of issues. But I think we've had, uh, we believe that, for instance, security issues are more important, right? At the time, you can have your house is on fire and you're looking for certificates. It's like you have a bigger problem to fix. So far, we tend to focus more on other things, improving our economy, security, education, and so on and so forth. Now, even though I believe that AI, the proper uses of AI, can also help in improving, fixing these other problems, it makes a lot more sense to focus on those things so far, right? Because to us, based on our context, based on our societal challenges are different, right? Europe, for instance, has a lot going on in technology. There's a lot of improvement, and there's need to have regulations. There's need to talk about. I think the EU's regulatory landscape for technology is scary. It scares me even. There are laws, there are decisions that I just look at them and I'm like, okay, now why would companies really want to come here? That's their opinion anyway. So again, I think we have a lot more to focus on that makes it look as if we're not really interested in AI, but we are because things are going on. The third thing is that we have more not very large organizations. An example, you have small organizations building, like I mentioned, SMEs or other small tech startups building, bringing some AI solutions for AI-based solutions for organizations, for governments, for companies way back in Nigeria. it doesn't make the news, right? OpenAI launches ChatGPT, whatever number, boom, and all over the feeds. You go to LinkedIn, everyone's talking about it. Microsoft comes up with something again. And finally, the last of the many points I could think of, in the collaboration. Now, even when the strategies where there's conversations between companies or countries in the global south and sometimes with the big tech, it becomes the sound of the contribution of the big tech to that conversation becomes louder. Again, maybe not totally the fault of any other parties in the conversation. It's just that the perception that people have this general perception that Africa is backward in technology. So whenever you see them on the table where technology is discussed, they are only listening, right? So at the end of the day, nobody really cares what they bring to the table. But I believe we bring a lot more. We bring a lot more. There's a lot of diversity in Africa, and it's a beautiful thing if we can bring the diversity into the conversation. I believe that the rest of the world can learn a lot from Africa, especially with regards to how we've been able to manage our diversity, how we've used it in every aspect, how we've used it in governance, how we've used it, and now we intend to use it also with AI adoption. Because I've seen some of these strategies that go deeper into, okay, let's look at our problems, like I just talked about Mauritius. Let's look at our local problems. Yeah. So this is just in a bit what I think the issues are. There are definitely many other reasons out there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why we are discussing this today
Yeah.
with you. It's just another chance, another opportunity to bring things up to other people's attention. And, as much as we can do,
Yeah.
we can talk about things that are not really newsworthy, I would say. But although I'm pretty sure if Africa came up with its version of DeepSeek, something headline grabbing AI model built in Africa. So I'm pretty sure it would be a bit of a stir that would draw attention to a lot of issues as well. So maybe someday we might see something in this regard as well. Uh, what I also wanted to kind of briefly talk about is Kenya. You mentioned in your presentation
Yeah.
that as well. The part I'm interested in, can you expand a little bit on the notion of just that's the how it's been called in the media and and just some tech circles, Kenya as the Silicon Savannah, in terms just the equivalent of Silicon Valley, but in Africa, so to speak. Why is it called that, and what's the significance of it, you think, for Africa?
Yeah. Thank you. I've also really thought of that. I've seen lots of conversations about Kenya as the Silicon Valley of Africa, and it sometimes uh, presents a different picture from what I would have in my mind, because uh, many people, especially we Africans, we know that Nigeria is the what I think is the wealth center of Africa with regards to human resources, with regards to tech startups, especially Lagos. I think Lagos has the largest number of tech startups in Africa, and it's a small city, right, comparatively. But over to I've not studied much of Kenya, but I noticed that there's a lot of attention from the global north in Kenya. I've mentioned twice where we've had this collaborations between tech companies. It's not just Kenya. There's also with Rwanda. Uh, there are conversations about smart city technologies and so on and so forth in that part of the world. So I believe that, again, aside the fact that they really do have a lot of tech startups, they have lots of conversations around technology, around AI going on. They seem to receive a lot of the focus from the global north, and unfortunately, sometimes it's not it's not a good thing. Like we see in the case of WorldCoin, people look at your pocket and see that you may not really have a lot of money, so you're easier to tempt with money, and they show up and say, okay, we have this. So there's a lot of inflow of some of these Western technologies going out there, and but I think that's going to slow down a little bit over time, because now some African countries, including Kenya, have started saying, okay, we need to hold on with this, right? Again, the idea that Kenya is the you know, the what they call it, the tech center of Africa. It's welcome basically, but I believe that there are other areas that have a lot more with regard to the conversations in technology. I agree that Kenya has a lot of attention. There's a lot of technology in there. There's a lot of things going on in Namibia, the capital, and there's lots of conversations. But then I believe that it's also about the perception of the people that on what we read from the news. When you see news like this, it's in Kenya. The other news, it's in Kenya. Or it's in Kenya. Meanwhile, in other countries like Nigeria, I mentioned earlier, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of small tech startups that are just all over the place. You would see them in health, you see them in finance, you'd see them scattered all over the place, and they are widely used in Africa. But I mean, people will perceive what they want to perceive. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's switch to your second talk point,
Yep.
which you covered brilliantly. But I wanted to kind of dig deeper into the national AI, the idea of national AI as this that national priority at this point. Countries are developing their own, for example, American-made AI, whatever this means. Other countries are focusing on building their own LLMs
Models.
trained
Yeah.
on their language,
Yeah.
and the culture, absorbing the culture. I think things are shifting from this Western-centric other countries, at least who are able and have resources to build their own models. They're trying to shift away from this Western-centric models trained predominantly on the English language to establish, I would say, something of their own when it comes to AI tools. Again, coming back to this national priority, it's something that the nation should be working on. It's that pertains to the culture and reflects all the aspects of the culture of this country. Is it something that's in the works in Africa at this moment? Just judging by everything that kind of you are monitoring, possibly, because I don't think I've heard of anything that's going on right now. Just any models that are being built. For example, is in South Korea. They've been working on Clover, a Korean LLM that's been trained only on Korean alphabet and Korean language and all data in Korean. So, what is there anything that you can say about it?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. First of all, like you said, yes, I've noticed many countries have tried to come up with their own models, right? Some due to security issues, to be sure, some due to ethical issues, and so on. We've had, um, some countries come up with that. Um, in Africa, so far, I'm not sure that there's any, you know, let's come up with any conversation around this. Let's come up with something central. Like I said, I'm not sure. I haven't really been to Africa in a while. I haven't had those conversations with policymakers. There's a lot of news online, but I try not to depend on that. Most times when I get information on the state of AI regulation in Africa, I get it from policymakers, I get it from legislators, I get it from people who are in the circle. So I'm certain of what information I have. And if I don't have that, there's a lot of news online that you don't really want to depend on. But be that as it may, I believe that if we don't have that so far, we don't have African countries trying to focus on that, even though there's need for it, right? There are studies that indicate that, for instance, in the case of language, um, forgotten how they put it, there's a lot of bias when it comes to the training of language models, and this bias tends to favor, the guys up there, and Africans tend to be at the receiving end of this biases. So it becomes very important to build these projects. But it's easy to build an LLM with when your budget for technology is like the GDP of 10 countries put together, right? Economic circumstances. LLMs are expensive to build, and I know that. Then we also look at the environmental costs of building one. Um, Africans are really weary of things that are going to have issues with the environment. Yeah, we have lots of problem with oil already, uh, and gas flaring and so on and so forth. So if we have to bring up things again that we have to start dealing with environmental issues, we need to think again. So aside the financial implications of building this, even if we had smaller organizations that wanted to build this, I'm not sure they would, back in Africa, I'm not sure they'd be able to really afford it, right? So right now we could be looking at collaborating with some other big tech companies, to have this kind of support. This is what I think is likely to come up in the next couple of years, maybe in the next couple of months. That's the second reason. But the third reason, and what I think is really, really important, is that the diversity again in Africa is wild. When you talk about language, not with in the case of natural language, the large language model and language in itself, right? Um, Nigeria has over 500 languages registered, more than 500, right? Not dialects, because if you look at dialects, there will be a lot more of them. If you were to build a large language model for a country with this diversity, you're going to need to collect data. If you want it to be inclusive, then you're going to have to travel a lot. Aside the language, there are religions, there are many religions, there are many customs, the society is just wildly diverse. Sometimes I think we're just special. The ability to be that diverse and we can still stick within the same boundaries is something we really need to think about. So I feel this is something that we're not sure how to deal with first, right? Okay, I
Mhm.
thought somebody else joined us. We're not sure how to deal with, to be certain that we're not biased against one part of the country or the other. Already there are questions in Nigeria, for instance. The major languages are Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba, and the other ones keep saying, "Yeah, are we not also important?" With regards to the numbers, these are the ones that have the largest number of speakers. Others say, "Yeah, we have Fulani, we have this." It reflects in our political circumstances. It reflects in everything, our religions, and so on. So if we start having a central model for Nigeria, for instance, not even the rest of Africa, it's going to require a lot more than just use English language to build or just get data from. I know Europe is diverse, but it's not that different when you compare to the diversity we have in Africa. We have cities in southern Nigeria. At least I know a small community in southern Nigeria where males and females speak different languages, right? So it's that diverse. It goes down to the roots. So in such communities, how do you bring in the perspectives of everyone? We have the rich poor gap. We have a lot of diversity, and this would become a problem if we begin to think. I'm not saying this is the position of the government or this is the position of the direction of.
Mhm.
I am thinking that this is, if I were in the policy making space, if I were to build an LLM, this would be the problem I would have in thinking about these things. So that's what I think the issue is. But then I look forward. I really do hope we can fix these problems and have something that is our own, something that has our cultural nuances, something that can, maybe we can agree on some languages. We may not be able to have everything, just agree on certain things, and we are able to bring that home into some kind of technology that's available for Africans. And so
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly that's certainly a direction
yeah,
to move in, because at the end of the day, I think that would be the most viable case for this tech, if you will, if we want to,
yeah,
countries to stay, not be this, not, just the whole world. Otherwise, the whole world will just turn into this one homogenized lump of AI generated stuff, content and text. Everybody will be regurgitating the same things over and over again, versus
yeah.
the diversity, the way it is today, has to somehow transfer into this digital AI reality that we are sooner or later we're all gonna end up in, you know. And that's my view on it. So I have no idea how we're gonna get there, but that would be the this ideal world, right? The ideal scenario of things to happen. On the subject of the Western influence and the Western norms and language, let's talk about just briefly. Let's talk about lobbying. How widespread is it in terms of you mentioned 16 out of 54 countries, I believe,
Yeah.
already have come up with their AI strategy.
Yeah.
How is there any indication of a widespread lobbying or any type of lobbying from the Western countries or big tech companies? Are they trying to sway things one way or the other in any shape? What
Well,
is your take on this?
definitely. Even though these are very political issues, right, that usually don't come to the public space. But I would be surprised if there's no big tech lobbying around Africa trying to get strategies. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, right? I had some information, sometime last year, that some big tech organizations are in Africa with regards to AI in health. But what they're trying to do so far is to first have some, contribute to the regulatory space in such a way that it allows them to bring in whatever technology they have. And this is not something very new. We've had it even in Europe. It's something that happens everywhere. Uh, it's not just because it's Africa. It's just because these are political conversations and also economic conversations. So you want to bring your product into a market, and especially in Africa, where we don't really have lots of regulations in this area. So that's and they must have tested this in other places where, if you don't contribute, if you cannot direct the legislation to a large extent, when it's implemented, it's probably going to affect whatever product you're bringing in. And we've seen this in Europe. We've seen this in the conversations around leading to the AI Act. So yes, I believe. And when you look at some of the collaborations, um, there's an African document, the strategy. I it totally just popped out of my head some months ago that came up, and it was signed in Rwanda. And in that document, there was um, a little note that this was reached with support from the Gates Foundation. And I went on to ask, what kind of support was that? I mean, with regards to transparency, we need to know, was it financial? Is the support deep enough to enable the supporter to control the direction of regulation in this area? Because there's a level of support that somebody gives to you, and the person becomes a partner in the project, right? Can determine the direction of things. Sometimes when I look at when tech companies threaten countries like Nigeria, you would read news like Meta saying to the Nigerian government, okay, if you're going to stress us with penalties, we're just going to pack up and leave. The first thing that pops into my head is that this is not the expected. It's like, this is not what we agreed, right? You can't do that to a sovereign government. You can't make those kind of statements. So I believe there's a lot of lobbying going on, and it's not unexpected. It's just that in the case of Africa, you may have what they bring to the table for the lobbying may be different, right? Let's say OpenAI or Microsoft goes to the European Union and says, "Hey, this is what we need." The conversation is going to be, at some level, but financially speaking, there's going to be a little difference between, in this kind of conversation when it goes down to Africa. First of all, in Europe, you're dealing with the whole union in many instances, right? But in Africa, the African Union is not as strongly connected as the European Union. So you'd find it's more like divide and conquer thing. You find smaller countries. You go to Kenya with as low as Namibia with 3 million people, and so on. So it's hard to come to the table with, being at par with the guy on the other side. Some big tech companies are wealthier than many countries, and this makes the conversation more complicated because you're coming from a place of disadvantage. And they always come up
Yeah.
with, well, I want to help you, but you need to do this for me. Then I can help you. And then people get paid. There are questions about corruption in these conversations and so on and so forth. Like I said, it's not different from other places. It's just that the power balance in the case of Africa shifts a little bit more on the side of the big tech. So yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. That's really, I think that's a crucial point, as you
Yeah,
said. European Union versus the African Union. Is European Union is this united front, so to speak, with all this slew of regulations, different type
hmm,
of
yeah,
laws, and pretty harsh enforcement, I would say, how the US views it anyway. But when we're talking about the African Union, we're talking about 50 plus countries that are literally different countries, and that not there's not really much that unites them in terms of just when it comes to negotiation.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and which brings me to your third top point that you discussed is poor working conditions for data annotators and people who are working in these harsh conditions by just looking at some very disturbing content every day, very low pay, and obviously big tech companies are exploiting that. But you also mentioned in our prep call that the governments are also to blame when it comes to this. Can you talk a little bit more about this side
Sorry, can you quickly
of the
say
story?
the last sentence? I didn't get that. The last one, yeah.
Yeah, I said that in our prep call when we were talking about
Yeah,
this as well. Um, we talked about how the technology and the big tech
yes,
companies are exploiting that,
yeah,
precisely that issue. But you also mentioned that the governments are also to blame when it
yeah.
comes to this. There are two sides of this story. Let's talk about the other side.
The other side, yeah, definitely. Thank you for raising that. I think it just totally popped out of my head. Many times when we have these conversations, everybody says, "Yeah, it's the big tech companies, it's the globals." I see the big tech companies as just businessmen, right? You create an environment that looks business savvy, that looks like they are capitalists. They want to
Attractive.
make money. Yeah. So when it's attractive, when you create the conditions, they come in. Why this does not happen there? I mean, there are small countries also in Europe that are not as wealthy as Germany or as Sweden and so or Finland and Denmark. They are the smaller ones also, but people don't really go there. The big tech companies rarely would you would rarely hear this kind of issues. Um, when we look at Africa, some of the things we refuse to accept is that we have internal problems that attract this external attention, negative attention. We have economic problems. I'm not saying the rest of the world does not have this kind of problem, but it's just really more complicated. When you imagine a situation where somebody is willing to work for $1.30, uh, you know, it's per hour, a 9 hour shift. Now, just imagine the working condition. The 9 hour shift, having to label 250 text messages and being exposed to those kind of contents, it simply shows that two things. First of all, you don't have a lot of regulations to control what happens to the labor force, right? So anything goes. Even if you have it, implementation is just not there. So one. Secondly, when you have people that are not really, the financial capabilities are not really there compared to the other parts of the world. I've heard the arguments that, yeah, the value of $1 in Kenya is, you know, looking at the economy itself would just be the same thing with what the value of, say, 20, 30, or $40 that their colleagues are getting in the US. But the idea is, it doesn't, my opinion again, I don't think it should matter. Um, I don't think it should matter what the value of the money is down here. It should what should matter is that what people over there are getting, these people should get, and then we look at the conditions. Now, the government ought to provide for its people. When you create a society where the economy is not as conducive for the people um, to walk comfortable, to be able to reject some of these flashy looking things, then you're likely people need to get money, and there's money. Like the BBC couches it says it's free money. So it's like we're doing typically nothing to get this amount of money every day, right? So again, the government has a lot of responsibility with regards to creating regulations to curb this. Where the regulations are not there, then you're going to find people who want to make money come. Secondly, um, there's also the economic circumstances of many countries in Africa has to really move forward. There's a lot going on, especially in the last 1 2 years, but I think we could do more because when people are left in these circumstances, it just exposes the society to whoever has the money to pay for services and whatever he decides to pay. It gives him, that more power over those smaller communities. So that's my opinion.
Is there I know, and you mentioned that you're talking to some people
Yeah,
who are based in Africa and some decision makers and regulators. Are
yeah.
there any efforts underway at all to try and tackle that? I understand the amount of issues people are dealing with, but just notwithstanding this fact, is there any discussions that might potentially address this issue, or the governments are pretty much okay with whatever has been happening?
Yeah, there are always discussions around this. They've been there. Like I said, the problem is not many times is not just with regulation, but the implementation, right? In many countries, we have labor laws, we have fundamental rights laws and procedures that should curb some of these working conditions, but the enforcement is lacking, right? So there are always conversations. Africa, most of Africa, let me not generalize it. Most of Africa seems to be reactionary in that we wait for something to go wrong and then we'll go, okay, we should fix that. You see this every time something goes wrong, and then the court, in the case of the world coin case, the court says, no, you can't do that. Let's roll it back. Sometimes some damage may have already been done, or in the case of WhatsApp and Facebook sharing data and WhatsApp data and so on and transferring it abroad, and the Nigerian court saying, no, you can't do that. And this had already been run for a couple of years. So, yes, there's always conversations about how to improve the workforce. Um, in local circles, the government in many countries tries to fix this. Sometimes they try to not just to focus on the people, but they try to create such tax regimes that would, when as you're coming in, as the big tech companies are coming in, they pay enough tax for the government to be able to provide for certain amenities to make the conditions a lot better for people. Many times it doesn't work. Again, like I said, some corruption issues in the middle, which is not very peculiar to Africa. I say that a lot of times, but it's just
Yeah.
a little different. It just looks special. Yeah, I think there's a lot more we could do. There's a lot more that is being done, especially in the last 1 2 years. But the journey ahead is still far out there. And I really do hope we can fix some of these things, because we can't have, even at the global level, we can have conversations about AI ethics when it's like people wearing gold, and then you see the pictures of kids sitting in mines and digging out gold. Some of them are hungry, and of course the pictures look really scary, but these are real pictures of real human beings, real lives, real children, right? So definitely it's something that I know some governments are trying to have conversations around this area, but then we just need to see how the implementation goes in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. It
Thank
was a
you.
very insightful conversation, and I learned a lot. And even preparing for this
Yeah.
call, as I usually am, I learned actually quite a lot. And I'm very happy that we got to do this talk with you.
Thank you so much, Alina. I'm glad to have been here, and I really hope later I'll look at the comments and see if we have some different opinions on some of these things, right? Because I believe
Um,
that the
uh,
conversation should go on a lot longer.
I'm sure there will be some opinions for
Yeah,
sure after
there
this
will
one.
be,
I'll post the link to
surely.
this to the recording. later. So you'll wake up. You might wake up to some interesting comments your
Okay,
morning. We'll
I'll
see.
look at it tomorrow then. Yeah.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much
much.
once again. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching and listening to us. And we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.